On This Week in Enterprise Tech, the future of SDN is a video game, sudo all the time, and Kingston knows their SSDs. Twiet on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twiet. This Week in Enterprise Tech, Episode 81, recorded March 3rd, 2014. Kingston knows SSDs. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Prosper. Prosper is a peer-to-peer lending marketplace which connects people who are looking to borrow money with those who have money to lend. Visit prosper.com/twit and receive a $50 Amazon.com gift card when you get a loan. And by TechServe, the world's largest independent Apple retailer and professional services provider. Go to techserve.com/twiet-7sins to get access to the free ebook on 7 Deadly Sins of iPad deployment. Welcome to Twiet, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Battleser, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. And I'm joined by my regular fantastic panel of geeks, starting with Mr. Brian Chi, the director of the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii. Brian, it's so good to have you back. You were gone briefly. I think you were working on some Maker stuff last week?
No, actually, Maker is in a couple weeks, March 15th. No, last week I was pretending to be an oceanographer. And we had a booth at the Ocean Sciences Expo for the Aloha Cabled Observatory. And we got all kinds of people wanting to do work with us. And who knows, maybe we're going to be doing a Kickstarter to go and put a undersea observatory at the Titanic.
Now, didn't I understand that you were going to be including either Megatron's arm or SpongeBob SquarePants in this Kickstarter?
Well, actually, what's happening is because things like National Science Foundation and so forth are really drying up as far as funding, we've had to go and look for non-traditional sources of funding. So one of the things I've been doing is trying to go out and do marketing. So when the last Transformers film was going to come out, I was trying to sell them on putting Megatron's arm in view of the camera as kind of, an Easter egg. But my PI's chickened out and wouldn't let me cross that tacky line.
Brian Chi, supporting conspiracy theorists since 2014. Also joining us is the editor of Enterprise Efficiency, Mr. Curtis Franklin, good friend and geek from Florida, the other side of the country. Curtis, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Padre. Got to walk around some marshes and swamps on Saturday. And I'm heading to Austin, Texas tomorrow, where, if the weather reports are to be believed, I'll be able to experience thunder sleet, which may be the next big hair metal band. I don't know. But in between times, I'm doing great.
Wait a minute. Are you going to South by Southwest?
Actually, I have to leave Austin the day before South by Southwest proper starts. I'm going to be working Wednesday and Thursday, and then back to Florida on Friday.
Well, gentlemen, it's good to have you aboard. What do you say we talk a little bit about some Enterprise Bytes?
Sounds like a plan.
Let's get to it. The first one is, well, you want to know what the future of Enterprise-class SDN, that software-defined network, looks like? Well, look no further than a video game. That's right. So Respawn Entertainment is about to release a much-anticipated, actually looks fantastic, multiplayer game called Titanfall. It's going to be released on the PC and the Xbox One first, then onto the Xbox 360. The visuals on this game are incredible. There's a lot of buzz. I actually got to play a couple of hours of beta play, and it's really, really good. Very tight, and the user experience is nice. But, of course, we don't care about any of that, right? Because this is an Enterprise show. What we do care about is what's going on in the background. Now, there have been many high-profile failures of online game launches. Let's think back to SimCity a while back, where people couldn't even sign in to register their product. Amazon actually stopped selling it because so many people were complaining that they had bought this new game and And, well, EA servers just couldn't handle the load. You've got the release of the PS4, the PlayStation Network, which was supposed to be revolutionary from the PS3 network, and then for the first 2 weeks or so, no one could log in just because they didn't anticipate where the spikes and the blooms would be. Well, Respawn Entertainment did this very nice letter out to the fans explaining why they've gone the route that they have. Now, essentially, let me do the highlights for you. They talked about the different ways of doing a back-end gaming server. You could have peer-to-peer, player-hosted servers, which was what's the old way of doing things on the PS3, where one of the players becomes the host, the server that sends the commands to all the other stations of this is what's being shot, this is who's been hit, this is what game and what map we're playing. But the problem with that is it gets laggy and you're dependent upon a host who may be cheating. There's also dedicated servers, and this is what EA tried to do, buy a ton of dedicated servers and make sure that they're all online for the launch. The problem is dedicated servers don't handle a geographic load very well. In other words, if you buy 1 million servers and you put them in San Jose, but all your load ends up being in Singapore, it's still going to lag, it's still going to fail. So what Respawn decided to do was to go with Microsoft Azure, because what Azure can do is give you a real SDN, a software-defined network. Remember, we talked about Microsoft Autopilot. Well, if it can dynamically assign what servers it uses depending on where the load is coming from, it's an ideal platform for launches. This is what I want to throw over to you first, Cheebert. This is a video game, but it's a great model for companies who want to launch services on the internet, right? I mean, if I'm launching a new service, I don't want to have to worry about, do I have the server capacity in the right place? Instead, I could go to a global service partner like Microsoft and say, put me on Azure, put me on Autopilot, and wherever the need pops up, automatically bring up more server capacity.
Yeah, the key thing here is Autopilot. Software-defined networks, clouds, and global load balancing all dovetail nicely together. But if and only if you spend some time and create a set of rules, business rules on how to handle load. Because remember, computers themselves are pretty dumb until you start giving them very explicit instructions. And that's what Autopilot really does. It gives you ability to represent your business rules on how to handle load, where to shift it, how to shift it, when to shift it. Those are the big issues here. And this is not rocket science. We've had little baby steps on the way. You know, back in, a couple years back in Interop, we were using Coyote Point, and we were doing some very interesting load balancing when the show wasn't on the show floor. We actually load balanced between the 3 large colos, Sunnyvale, Denver, and Newark, so that whenever anyone went to interrupt.net, it would load balance between one of those. Microsoft's Autopilot takes this a lot further. Keep in mind, Microsoft has data centers all over the world, and being able to shift that load closer to you has been, it's been the holy grail of global load balancing to begin with.
Yeah. Curtis, let's go over to you to talk about that global load balancing. This is something that I think there are a lot of enterprises who are just figuring it out, because it used to be, well, just get yourself 3 big colos, 4 big colos, normally all located in the United States, and everything else just sort of follows. With this announcement, a major company relying on Azure for a major launch that is going to get a huge spike, which could be a very visible disaster for Microsoft if it goes wrong. Do you think if it goes well that more enterprises will say, okay, we need a global presence, we need a system that can automatically handle global shifts, not just between time zones in the United States, but across countries across the globe, and one that can be fault tolerant?
Well, I think that all of the things that you mentioned are absolutely critical, and something like this is going to be closely watched by a lot of people in the enterprise to see how those very issues play into the response that the customers get. And that's really critical. When we talk about global load balancing, as you said, traditionally we've talked about 3 or 4 co-locations, often on the same continent or within the boundaries of the United States, say. What people have found out is that even though electrons and photons travel at the speed of light or pretty darn close to it, when you're talking about massive numbers of users on performance critical applications, and games qualify, then latency matters and latency can be impacted in an enormous way by how close the server is to the machine making the request. I think that we're going to see a lot more companies looking at putting servers close to the customers for these critical needs, and look not only at games, but at financial applications, at video applications, and at the kind of high demand retail applications that can make a company, let's say one named after an enormous rainforest in South America, can provide great customer service even as their customer base is growing.
Right. Nice. Now, Max1234 in the chat room says, can we dig into the bits regarding Microsoft Autopilot? We actually covered a lot of that last week in the Enterprise Byte. We've got a guest coming into the show who will specifically address Autopilot. But till then, we're going to leave you with this. Please go play Titanfall. And if it does well, you know that's what the next Enterprise is going to use. Let's talk about the second story, and that is, Cheebert, check this out. 94% of all attacks on Microsoft Windows could be prevented if we stopped people from running as administrator. Now, before I dig into the story at all, do you find that surprising?
No, not at all. In fact, one of the first suggestions is get rid of administrator. And you can now, especially in Server 2012, and you can in Linux. So why not?
Yeah. This is one of those dirty secrets about IT. I actually spoke about this on the Tech Guy on yesterday, on Sunday, which is we buy a lot of gear. We buy millions of dollars worth of security gear every year, billions actually, if you go around the world. And we don't tell people that most of that can't fix the simple problem that people are doing stuff on their computer that they shouldn't. You remove the administrator privileges, which most people don't need, and suddenly all those vulnerabilities that scare the pants off of you into buying all that equipment goes away. Curtis, this was a study done by, what was it, a company called Avecto. I'm not exactly what they're a Manchester, United Kingdom-based company that specifically does privilege management. Now, the study was called 2013 Microsoft Vulnerabilities, Mitigating Risk by Removing User Privileges. But they found that 92% of critical vulnerabilities could be mitigated if default admin rights were removed across the enterprise. Now, in the study, the way that they did it was they went through all of the security bulletins issued by Microsoft in 2013 to determine which vulnerabilities were allowed by users running with administrative rights. Specifically, they looked for the executive summary. That's the thing that just execs read. For the sentence, users whose accounts are configured to have fewer user rights on the system could be less impacted than users who operate with administrative user rights. In other words, they were looking for that key phrase, that statement that was found in so many Microsoft bulletins saying, yeah, if you weren't running as administrator, you really don't have to worry about this. Let me throw this over to you. Is this something that I, as an IT person, could go to my execs and say, listen, I know you want me to come up with security things. I know you want me to buy gear, but the best thing we could possibly do is re-educate our entire workforce.
Well, re-educating the entire workforce is always a solid idea, but from the enterprise perspective, this is nothing new. I mean, going back to Windows 7, if you'll recall, we did away with the easy privileged execution of installs and other commands when we were trying to, for example, install new software. It's the sort of thing that companies had been crying for. They got it in Windows 7. It continues in Windows 8. So from the enterprise level, this is nothing that hasn't been effectively done so far. The place that it really hit was at the consumer level, and with things like bring your own device and people doing remote work, that becomes important. We've all had the experience of trying to install some new piece of software, and it could be quite legitimate, a code editor or a new mail program, something to let us do legitimate work. And in the Windows universe, it required admin access and multiple reboots, which could each require acknowledging and confirming the admin access. Most people got tired of that after about the first program they installed, disabled it, and we're back in the same old problem. So I think that what we really need is a twofold thing. One, get rid of admin access for most cases, both for consumers and enterprises. And two, train the damned application developers to not require it for legitimate applications. Do those two things, and you put a lot of the malware folks out of business.
Now, Cheaper, we've got Java789, longtime member of our chat room, who says he's educated his users beginning with suspicious attachments. He considers it his third line of defense. That's interesting because I think that's what a lot of IT people think, that changing the behavior of the users or changing their permissions is something you do after everything else. But with this study, which again, let me run down some of the numbers, found that 92% of all the things that could be fixed by removing administrative rights, 92% of all the 147 critical vulnerabilities posted in 2013, 96% of all the critical vulnerabilities affecting the Windows operating system, 100% of all vulnerabilities affecting Internet Explorer, 91% of all the vulnerabilities affecting Microsoft Office, 100% of all remote code execution exploits, 80% of all critical information leak vulnerabilities, and 60% of all vulnerabilities published in 2013 combined. It sounds to me that that shouldn't be the third line of defense. That should be your first line of defense.
Yeah, well, I happen to agree with Java because I also kind of say second or third line of defense only because it is the hardest one to implement. Users are inherently stubborn. Users are too used to having the IT people crying wolf. And a lot of them don't believe us anymore. And so you concentrate on the low-hanging fruit, the things that you can do. I will actually run more, enterprise-grade firewalls just to protect my users that are too lazy, you insert whatever adjective you want, to even patch their machines. I know lots and lots and lots of researchers that run as administrator just because they're too lazy. So yeah, changing user behavior is a very, very long process. It really actually has to start happening in places like middle schools, high schools, colleges. People have to get used to it because once they say, oh, just log in as administrator to go to town, you've lost the battle already. So I totally agree with Job on this issue.
Now, I do want to bring into the discussion something that CR1 in the chat room has mentioned. He says, why would IT people want to limit the damage users might do? They'd be working themselves out of a job. You can't fix stupid, but you can profit from it. Okay. With that piece of jaded wisdom, I think let's move on to the next enterprise bite. This time, we're talking about a potential security breach, but maybe it's a security breach with a difference. You see, Sears has reported that they are working with the Secret Service to determine whether or not there was an intrusion that resulted in lost data from their network. This is a different kind of breach because in the past we've seen Target, we've seen Neiman Marcus, who went through an exhaustive process before they even breathed a word about their security breaches, which resulted in millions upon millions of customers' information being compromised. In this case, Sears is going public before there's even proof that any information was taken. In fact, there was a story that was written just yesterday saying that both the Secret Service and a third-party digital forensics team has not yet been able to determine if data was pulled off of the servers to a third-party location. Now, I want to throw this over to you first, Curtis. Might this become the new template for discussing breaches? Because the old way of dealing with it in the enterprise is to cover, deny until you can no longer deny it. Sears seems to be taking a different tact, which is, look, people understand there's going to be data breaches. Let's be upfront right now, even though we don't know whether or not something has actually been taken.
Well, it's going to be very interesting, and often I think this is one of the sort of thing that's going to be resolved in an increasing number of cases at the very highest level of the organization. I was just looking as you were doing the introduction to this piece at a piece in the Wall Street Journal where they talked about, in the case of Target, that the CEO actually had to do battle with his own board of directors because the board didn't want him to release as much information as he did. the knee-jerk reaction from a lot of organizations, especially at the board of directors level, is to keep all of this information as private as possible because they're worried about the litigation. They're worried about the lawsuits. If some law firm that wants to see a large payout gets wind of a breach, they will be filing lawsuits before the company even has a chance to work with law enforcement and respond. It's going to be an interesting thing to see how well we have to deal with this. And what I think the ultimate answer is will be something that's similar to the engineering code of ethics. You know, when engineers see a problem and come forward, work to ameliorate that problem, they are professionally shielded from some levels of liability. I think that we're going to need to go toward that with our IT departments to encourage them to come forward with information as early as possible to cooperate with the maximum number of financial institutions and law enforcement organizations to solve the problem, and to increase rather than reduce the level of transparency around these data breaches.
Chibert, let me throw that over to you, because let's step away from Target or Neiman Marcus for just a second and compare it to something else. You've got Sears, which, okay, admittedly, the Sears itself is not doing so well, so maybe this is not a major corporation. But you've got Sears coming forth way before they had to, way before they maybe was legally prudent, in order to maintain their relationship with the customers. On the other side, you have something like Mt. Gox, which had a breach for years that was draining their accounts. And you cannot tell me that they didn't notice that there were millions and millions of Bitcoins going missing for years without checking your balance sheets. That's doing it on the other side, where no one got wind that there was a problem until the very end and they had to go bankrupt. Somewhere in between those two, there's got to be a happy medium, right? I mean, there's got to be something that will both be legally good for the company and good policy for IT.
Actually, I think my big suggestion to anyone is www.infragard, infragard.org. It's up on the screen now. It is an organization sponsored by the FBI, and it's open to anyone in the United States that can have a quick and dirty background check. It's basically a criminal background check, and it gives you access to what is normally labeled as for government use only. There are InfraGard chapters all over the United States, and you can join with your fellow businesses and talk about security issues, talk about the latest patches, you know, what's going to work, what's not going to work, what kinds of things can you do to protect yourself. They have speakers coming in from all kinds of different organizations, including a lot of the credit card companies, it's talking about PCI and so forth, to help you be better netizens, I guess you could call it. And things like that, it allows you to leverage the experience of very, very large organizations so that you don't have to, in theory, pay with the College of Hard Knocks. Strongly recommend it. Does not cost hardly anything. You know, usually it's just parking and a lunch. Well worth your time, well worth your effort. Give your IT people time to go to these lunches so they can go and trade information with some of the best in the industry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, when we come back, we're going to be speaking with Cameron Crandall, who is with Kingston Technology. He's going to be telling us a little bit about SSDs. But before we do that, I'd like to welcome to the Twiat Riot a brand new sponsor, Prosper. Now, if I told you that you could have up to $35,000 a day within a couple of hours, 72 hours or so, what would you do with it? Now, would you pay off your high-rate credit card? Would you start a business? Would you finally do that home improvement that you've been waiting to do for years? Well, if I told you that by filling out a couple of forms and providing a few details, you could see a rate online instantly without ever stepping foot in a bank, would you take it? Well, that's not a fantasy, folks. That's Prosper. Prosper is an innovative peer-to-peer lending process, Silicon Valley's answer to a more modern community-based personal loan. There are no outrageous fees, no raising interest rates, and yes, you'll never step foot in a bank. I remember back in the day when my computer consultation company started expanding past the point at which my resources could support it, I needed cash. I needed cash to expand, which meant that I needed a loan from a bank, and that process was as demeaning as it was confusing. showing one bank manager after another that my business wasn't just cash positive, but profit flush with a need just enough cash for to fulfill my existing contracts. It quickly turned me into a jaded person that I am today. I wish Prosper had existed back then. Then I could have saved myself the wear and tear of the bank shuffle and gotten the cash that I needed immediately. Now, Prosper offers low fixed rates, unsecured personal loans, that means no collateral required, and has multi-year terms available. Prosper has more than 2 million members and over 900 million in funded loans. Now, folks, this is a revolution in financing. It's different than anything that you've known before. I know there are a lot of really, well, let's just say, interested parties who might be a little skeptical. Well, if you're skeptical, look them up for yourself. We don't want to push you in anything that you may not be comfortable with. But we're excited because this is an expansion of the micro-lending trend that became so popular overseas. The idea of taking the bank out of the middle and letting people lend to people. That's what Prosper is all about. Now, just go to prosper.com/twit to check your rate instantly without affecting your credit score. That's another cool thing. You can look at what your rate will be for how much money you need, and it's not going to give you a report on your credit rating that will affect your score, which would make future loans, well, more difficult. Now, here's what we want you to do. For a limited time, Prosper is offering Twit viewers a $50 Amazon gift card when you get a loan. Go to prosper.com/twit. That's prosper.com/twit, a special site just for our viewers. You get up to $35,000 in just 3 days and receive a $50 Amazon gift card when you get that loan. Prosper.com is not affiliated with Amazon. For gift card details, visit prosper.com/twit. And we thank Prosper for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Let's get to it. We've got here in the studio Cameron Crandall. He's the Senior Technology Manager for Kingston Technology, www.kingston.com. Crandall, thank you so much for making the journey up here.
Sure, thanks for being here.
Now, SSDs are becoming the de facto standard for anything that's about serious computing. I mean, it made a big splash in the consumer end, but more recently, enterprises are realizing that especially databases with high transaction rates can benefit from the use of SSDs. Now, what are the things that you believe IT folks need to pay attention to when they're choosing SSDs to install in their enterprise-based solutions?
Well, I think they need to look at their workload in particular, and I think there's a variety of different SSD options on the market to fit different workload needs. For example, if you've got an environment that's more heavy read than write, there's a lower cost option for an SSD solution for those types of workloads. If you have a very high write endurance application, we obviously have drives on the higher end that cost a little bit more, but provide longer write endurance life for that particular application. We have drives that have power fail circuits on them in case there's sudden power loss to the server. We'll commit any writes that are in motion to flash and then shut the drive down properly. So I think one of the big things is knowing that there are a variety of different types of SSDs on the market that you have to choose from, but most importantly, understanding what your workload is and then selecting the right SSD for that application.
Right. I think this might be a good time to ask you the question, what's the difference between a quote-unquote enterprise SSD and a consumer-level SSD? Actually, Anthony, if you switch to my product cam, we've got examples of each. These two right here, these are considered consumer-level SSDs. This one's from Samsung, this one's from Kingston. Very, very fast, wonderfully efficient. But then we've got this unit. This is Kingston's 200 gigabyte SSD Now E, which denotes the enterprise model of the product line. Now, to the casual observer, if I plug this into my computer, they're all going to look like SSDs. They're all going to be fast. In fact, this is a tiny bit slower than the KC series, but it's going to be more expensive, and we know that's because it has certain features that enterprises will find appealing. What are those features?
So it depends on the manufacturer, but at Kingston, the way we differentiate an enterprise class drive from a client-based drive is one, the type of flash that we use on the device. So we use a 30,000 PE cycle flash on our enterprise grade drives and a 3000 PE cycle flash on the client drives. And obviously the reason for that is because the workloads are very different between what you and I do on a notebook or desktop computer during the day and what a server workload is doing. The other thing that differentiates a client drive from a enterprise drive is that power fail circuit I mentioned earlier. And again, it's an option for the customer as to whether or not they want a drive with the power fail circuit. But the power fail circuit is there to ensure that any writes that are in motion, if there's sudden power loss to the system, get committed to the flash memory, and then the drive is shut down properly. So in the Kingston case, it's the duty cycle or the PE cycles of the flash and that power fail circuit.
Right. We've got Keith512 in the chat room, who obviously is aware of Kingston products. He says, can we please have a 1 terabyte KC300? And I think what he's alluding to is we've used a lot of these products on my Twitch shows. In fact, I think every project that we've done that's involved a PC upgrade has probably used a Kingston KC300 SSD drive, just because I've come to trust them. And, you know, speed's one thing, but I also want something that's going to last me. So what I'd like to do now is break down the things that make an enterprise drive different, specifically looking at that I/O workload. Can you explain to me why the I/O workload, especially on an enterprise class server, which is going to be reading and writing a lot, way more than you would expect from, say, a desktop workstation, why does that affect the longevity of the drive?
So typically with a server class workload, we're doing lots and lots of transactions, and it's again much different than the typical Windows notebook or desktop. So if you're writing more randomly to the drive, that's going to affect the longevity of the drive, and it's going to wear more than if you are writing more sequentially to the drive. So typically in a server workload or a database workload, we're writing data in a very random fashion, which is accelerating the wear of the SSD.
Now, there's this phrase that I've heard uttered a couple of times. I really don't know what it means, especially in terms of looking at how long a SSD will last in an enterprise application, called write amplification. And I understand it has something to do with the interaction of block size, capacity, and randomness of the data being written and read, and those all affect endurance. But what is this write amplification, or is that just like a company-specific term?
No, it affects any flash device, whether it's a USB thumb drive or an SSD. Write amplification simply is the difference between the amount of data that was sent from the host and what was actually written to flash. So on a flash device, we have to write in full blocks, and this is sort of the Achilles heel of flash. If you have valid data pages within a block, we need to pull those data pages out, combine it with the new write coming in, and then rewrite that data back to flash. So essentially, you're writing data that's already been written before, and that's the write amplification factor.
So if you're writing, say, 2K to a 4K block, you're not just writing 2K, the effective write would be closer to 4K.
That's correct, or even more. I mean, you can have write amplification factors, and we saw in the old days of 50 to 100 times what was actually sent from the host.
Whoa.
Now that's gotten a lot better over time. I mean, I think the main goal of the SSD provider or the controller manufacturer is to limit the write amplification factor as much as possible. And I can tell you at Kingston, as well as other manufacturers, what we've done over the last several years is put a lot of techniques into our firmware to minimize the effects of write amplification.
Now, does write amplification hit enterprise applications more than, say, a consumer desktop?
It does, because of that randomness of how we're writing, which I was talking about earlier. So the more random the data is that gets written to the drive, you've got a higher write amplification. So yes, it does. Got
it. So in a consumer application, let's say I've got a video workstation using SSDs. The computer pretty much, it's only dealing with a couple of processes at any given time, so the data is not all that random. Whereas if I've got a drive sitting in a server handling input-output for a SQL database, the reading and the writing could be at so many different sectors at the same time, it ups that write amplification.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay, got it. All right, now let's move on to the reason why we brought you here. Is to talk about SSD management. Now, let's start out with the basic question, which is why do you need SSD management? I mean, isn't you just put it in and when it fails, you replace it? What exactly do you mean when you say you need to plan SSD management?
So one of the key factors of SSDs is, everybody knows that SSDs have a finite number of write cycles to the flash. So we want to be able to monitor the life of that drive over its use. And we do that through smart tools. Smart is a technology that's been around on hard drives for many, many years to monitor the health of hard drives, and that same technology has been adopted in the SSD industry. But we customize that a little bit because we're not monitoring the same features or attributes associated with a hard drive that we do on an SSD. So through Smart, you can see a variety of different attributes. One of the key attributes is basically the ability to look at a fuel gauge. So we have an attribute called SSD life left that starts out at a value of 100 and it descends to 0 over time. We can look at write amplification. We can look at what was sent from the host in terms of data size and what was actually written to flash. So we can actually analyze a workload and determine kind of life expectancy data from Smart. So Smart offers not only that fuel gauge, but really the granularity to look at a particular workload and make some analysis as to how long an SSD its useful life would be in that particular application.
Now, I want to get back to that estimation of lifespan, but really quickly, we do have a technical question coming from the chat room, and that is, when you talk about lifespan, why is it that some SSDs seem to really, really slow down as they get towards the end of their life cycle, and others don't lose as much of their speed? Specifically, I'm talking about the KC300. I tested one of these drives almost to the end of its life cycle, and I was still getting 80% of the original performance towards the end. I won't say what other manufacturer, but I did another manufacturer, and by the time I got through 20% of the life cycles, the write cycles, I was down a good 50% of performance.
Yeah, so great question. So one of the issues that really plagued SSDs early on, 4 years ago, was the fact that we didn't have good garbage collection routines built into our firmware. So we had a lot of invalid data in the NAND flash, and whenever you had to write to a block that had all of this invalid data, we had severe latencies associated with those writes. So it was very common early on to have an SSD that worked really, really fast out of the box, but 6 months later you were going slower than a hard drive. So that problem's really been solved today because garbage collection has gotten so good. We also have trim. Trim came about for that specific reason, and that was an operating system initiated flag that was sent down to an SSD to tell it which pages could be cleared of data, so we could write to clean data blocks. So really the goal with keeping the drive fast and maintaining steady state performance over the life of that drive is to keep it clean as possible, so that we don't have to merge any data when the host goes to write to the drive.
Right. Now, most of our audience is pretty savvy. And in fact, I'd say pretty much everyone in our chat room, except maybe Eric Duckman, would know how to take care of their SSDs, to make sure that they're running the proper maintenance software, to check the cycles, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. I've heard that it becomes very difficult to manage SSDs in an enterprise class network because most of the applications involve using some sort of RAID controller, either to increase speed or to increase fault tolerance. It's difficult to get a lot of that information through a RAID controller, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's one of the challenges we face today. In order to extract that smart data I was talking about earlier, we typically need to be attached to a native SATA port on the system board. Once we stick the SSDs behind a RAID controller, we lose the ability to easily access that smart data. Now, some of the third-party RAID controllers that are on the market provide a command line interface to be able to extract that data, but we don't see it in a nice GUI interface like we'd like to in the RAID management interface. So hopefully in the future, the RAID controller manufacturers will address this and make that smart output data part of their standard RAID management utility, or the graphical user interface.
Right. Now let's talk about trim, because people are going to ask about trim anytime we talk about the longevity of an SSD. What is it? Why did we need it? And why are we starting not to need it so much?
So trim it's a great feature. It's still supported on many of the SSDs that are in the marketplace today. It really came about to solve that slowdown problem with SSDs. So garbage collection is initiated by the controller on the SSD. So it's an internal housekeeping mechanism, where SMART is actually initiated by the file system. And the reason why SMART is capable of functioning is because the operating system knows which data has been deleted. So it goes and it sends a flag down to the SSD to tell it which data blocks and pages are ready to be cleaned, and then it's up to the controller on the SSD as to when or if it's going to do that cleaning. So again, trim and garbage collection are essentially trying to accomplish the same thing, and that is to clean out the invalid data pages, or essentially deleted data on the SSD, so that when new writes come into the drive, there aren't any latencies that would slow down that process.
Got it. Got it. Now, okay, let's go back up to the 10,000-foot view here for a second, because you're giving us some great technical details about how SSDs work and what makes an SSD longer lived, longer speeded. But the big question is still going to be, what's the takeaway for an IT person who's looking at managing SSDs in his, say, server farm? And I've actually come up with this. Old installations that have the old pizza box style servers, they've decided that they could get a bit more of life out of them just by replacing the old data drives with SSDs. If that's going to be the case, or even if I'm looking at a brand new installation of pure SSD installations, what are the things that I should be concerned about? You talked about how I should choose my drive, but once I've got them in situ, how should I manage them?
I think from an application use, I mean, obviously you want to put your most I/O intensive applications on SSDs anywhere where you've got are suffering from latency issues, where you may have developers that are calling you because their application is very, very slow. I think SSDs are an ideal use in those cases. In terms of managing those devices, again, there are tools that enable you to manage the wear on the drives, and again, they're seen as a standard SATA or SAS device through the controller. A lot of the new RAID controllers today are very much tuned for SSDs in their firmware. So when you plug an SSD into those controllers, their firmware actually acts a little bit different than if you were to put a hard drive into the system. So there are a lot of various tools that can be used for managing SSDs.
Nice, nice. Now, Cameron, when we come back, I would like to bring Brian and Curtis back into the discussion, because we're going to go over some specific enterprise topics about data security, data destruction, data recovery, and then get a little crazy about the overall maximum performance of an SSD. Can you stick around for that?
Sure.
Fantastic. But before we get to that, let's take a moment to break and talk about an old sponsor, good friend of the Twiat Riot, and that's TechServe. Now, we are seeing some amazing technology solutions based on the iPad. You must have seen them on your travels through your city, your state, your country, the world, whatever it might be. We know that the vertical market, the idea of having all the information you need in a single pane of glass, is a concept that has taken hold, and businesses are running with it. Businesses keep coming up with creative ways to service their customers, increase productivity among employees, and make more money with the same amount of resources, all by using the iPad. For example, the Institute of Culinary Education equips students, faculty, and chefs with the iPad, empowering them to do away with heavy and unwieldy textbooks and streaming the learning process. A major cable service provider in the Northeast gave its field technicians, who are the public face of the company, iPads that had been configured to provide better service to their customers. And retail companies have enhanced their in-store customer experience by using the iPad, not just as a point-of-sale device, but also as a spot where customers can learn about sales, special offers, and upcoming events. These clients and more have turned to TechServe, the country's largest Apple reseller that sells, supports, and manages the largest iPad deployments in the world, to manage their iPad projects. If you're considering adding iPads to your business, why not ensure the project's success with an experienced partner? TechServe assists businesses of all sizes to deploy Apple solutions, as well as solutions from Avid, Adobe, and more. TechServe throughout the United States can help you. No matter if you've started deploying iPads or are just getting started, TechServe has the experience and the back end to make your project a success. So here's what we want you to do. Right now, TechServe is offering a complimentary download just for Twiat listeners who are deploying iPads or who are interested in learning more about doing so. Go to techserve.com/Twiat-7sins to get access to the 7 deadly sins of iPad deployment document and see the common pitfalls that can throw companies for a loop during their iPad projects. That complimentary download is available right now just for Twiat listeners at tekserve.com/Twiat-7sins. And we thank TechServe for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. All right, let's get to the fun point, the fun part where we bring our panelists back in and we get to grill the guest. I'm sorry, Cameron, I didn't tell you about the grilling, but it's all part of the fun. Brian, what would you say is a concern that enterprises might have about storing sensitive data on SSDs?
Well, you know, hard drives are reasonably easy to destroy. Heck, when I was still doing a lot of work with 3-letter agencies, we would actually demagnetize them on degaussor big enough that if you wore a watch in the same room, your watch is no longer going to work. And then we go and grind them up and then stick it into a furnace. Now, obviously, the same thing's going to work for an SSD. Now, most enterprises don't have a 5,000-degree furnace on their back loading dock like I did. So being able to assure that they're not going to let proprietary information out the door on an SSD is a current worry. And a lot of, I know of few enterprises where there are stacks of retired SSDs still waiting on trying to figure out how to reliably make sure their competitors don't harvest competitive information off their old hard drives.
Now, Cameron, that sounds kind of paranoid, but we are paranoid in the enterprise. We're paid to be paranoid. And there is that worry that even if you use a secure data erasing program, something like, what's the one that people always talk about? Parted Magic. It has a secure data deletion section of their software suite. That somehow, and studies have been able to show that fragments of the data can still exist on an SSD. And they're freaked out about what that means as they retire these servers. They never know what's heading out the door as they let SSDs and servers go. Is this a serious concern? Is this something that people need to be worried about?
Well, I think the issue exists in terms of companies' sensitivity to data, and we see it every day at Kingston. I think to answer, how do you safely sanitize data on an SSD? It's been proven that an ATA secure erase is really the best method to do that because it's taking place at the physical level right on the drive itself. So you use a small software program. Typically, it's a DOS bootable drive, and you execute an ATA secure erase, which then trips off the controller to go out and clear all of the areas on the flash that contain data. But it's really up to the controller manufacturer on the SSD as to whether or not when they send that secure erase, they're actually touching all of the data areas on the flash memory itself. So the controller writes to the data area, the user area, but the controller also has a system area that needs to be wiped as well. So if you've got questions about this with the drives or SSDs that you're using, you want to get some assurance from the SSD manufacturer that when they do execute the secure erase, they are touching all of the areas of the flash and the drive is completely erased.
Right. We've got Scott Michaud in the chat room who says, here's what I do. Format secure wipe free space, then ATA secure erase. Which sounds great, but as you said, if the controller on the SSD itself isn't actually touching all the spaces during that command, it really doesn't matter what your security suite does, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. Now, so that actually sounds like a problem. Are there vendors that are better about making sure that that secure erases will hit all sectors?
There are, and there's been more of an awareness about this over the last couple of years. There was a university in Southern California that kind of exposed a problem with ATA secure erase. So it depends on the manufacturers. I know from a Kingston standpoint, when we execute a secure erase, we do completely wipe the data on the drive. We do have some customers that, even though we give them the documentation that says we wipe the drives clean, their drives do not leave their data center. So in those cases, Kingston will accept a certificate of destruction if there is a failure on an SSD as proof that the drive was destroyed, and we'll accept that as an RMA.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because that is a concern that I've heard. I won't say who, but maybe an organization that I work for actually has a stack of SSDs that have broken, but and we're just waiting to dispose them. They could be RMA'd, but they're worried that if they send them out, somehow the data could be recovered off those broken SSDs.
That's correct.
That sounds like an awesome program. So if we got a certificate of destruction saying, yes, these drives have been disposed of, you'll take that as an RMA and you'll send a replacement.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, I like that. Thank you. I will actually let you have a plug for that, because I like that. I like that. Curtis, let me go over to you. So we've talked about data destruction. We know that the data management program of most enterprises includes some sort of guidelines on when data should be securely destroyed. Let's talk about the other side, data recovery. Most enterprises have guidelines on how data can get restored. Yes, there's a lot of backups, but in the off case that data becomes corrupted, they have a plan for getting it back. Have you seen any of these plans? Has this been something that's been boiling in the enterprise cloud with enterprise efficiency?
Well, at the individual device level, this tends to be handled on a case-by-case basis, because let's admit it, it's the sort of thing that IT people hope they never have to deal with. In the ideal world, whenever a drive goes well and truly south, you've got backup, and you can just pull the data off the backup. So the idea of having to go to a particular failed physical device and recover whatever is on there is one of the things that tends to be an emergency one-off case. And in most cases, they'll simply send it off to one of the drive recovery services, write a great whopping big check, and get a new drive with the data on it. So I guess my question is, that's a fairly known process for spinning magnetic media. What kind of process exists for SSD, or is this one of those cases where the failure is well and truly permanent? If you lose a chip, you've lost the chip and everything on it.
Back to me.
Yeah, back to you.
Okay, yeah. So great questions. So I've had the opportunity to work with some of the leading hard drive data recovery companies that are also doing data recovery on SSDs, and the biggest challenge that those recovery companies face is they need a lot of proprietary trade secret information from the controller manufacturers of the SSDs in order to recover that data. And again, these are trade secrets by the controller manufacturers, and really the real magic and endurance and performance of an SSD is really in that flash controller. And the controller manufacturers are very reluctant to turn over any significant amount of information to the data recovery companies to make their recoveries more successful. So it is challenging. I do know that the data recovery companies are forming closer relationships with the controller manufacturers that are in the marketplace today. But typically at some point they do hit a roadblock in the recovery process, because the controller manufacturer will only divulge so much information. I do know that their success rate with flash recoveries has gotten better, but it's unfortunately not really close to the success rate on magnetic spinning disk.
Got it. Got it. Now we're running out of time, but I do want to get through a few more topics. So let's go into speed round mode. Now, are there any special considerations that IT managers should take into mind when they're building fault-tolerant or high availability systems? I know these are things that SSDs are being found in more and more, either the component versions or the PCI Express card versions or the rack mount versions. Is there... We've already talked about some of the basics of choosing an SSD, but what are the other special considerations that they might need to consider?
Well, I think if you're connecting SSDs in a traditional drive fashion, which is front loading into the server attached to a SATA or SAS RAID controller card, you want to keep doing the RAID practices that you've been doing with hard drives on SSDs. So if you've been mirroring an OS with 2 drives, you don't want to abandon that practice, because you're now using SSDs, and SSDs never fail. If you're building parity arrays with hard drives, you want to build those same parity arrays with SSDs. SSDs can fail. The failure rate is significantly lower than hard drives, but from a data security standpoint, you want to still implement those same RAID practices.
All right. Well, let's go into some practicals for people who are, because you are an engineer. Let's talk a little bit about engineering. If someone wants to build a high availability or fault tolerant or just a rip-roaring fast SSD array, what are the things that they should look at? I mean, for example, let's start with the RAID controller, because I know that a good RAID controller for rotating media is not necessarily a good RAID controller for SSDs.
Yeah, so when SSDs first hit the market, several years ago, you definitely got a big performance increase by just simply switching out the hard drive for the SSD. But at that time, the RAID controllers weren't optimized for SSD. They were optimized for spinning disk. So what we see today with the current crop of RAID controllers that's on the market is the RAID controller manufacturers have designed their firmware to be more optimized for SSDs. Not only have they made changes to their firmware, they've also increase the performance of the hardware aspects of the RAID controllers. They now have multi-core processors on them, DDR3 memory, all in support of being able to deliver more bandwidth and more IOPS for SSD attached solutions. So I think some of the key points is if you're building high performance storage arrays with traditional RAID controllers, you want to use the most current RAID controllers that are on the market, because they're more tuned for SSDs. You can pretty much fully saturate most RAID controllers today with about 6 to 8 high performance SSDs. That means you've fully saturated that RAID controller from a bandwidth and IOPS standpoint. Any drives that you would add beyond 6 or 8 drives, you're adding density, but you're not adding performance. Not saying that that's a bad thing, it's just the SSDs are so fast that they're able to saturate that RAID controller typically within about 6 to 8 drives.
Wow. Wow. Achiever, you've been playing around with a lot of SSDs. In fact, I know that you got a load of these enterprise class SSDs for use in a cluster. What's some of the secret sauce that you found over the years about building an SSD server?
A lot of it is rotating around you get what you pay for. If you buy cheap controllers, you buy cheap cooling assemblies, you buy cheap mounts that don't deal with vibration, you're going to pay for it in the end. Now, obviously, vibration is not really the enemy of SSDs. It could be, depending on what kind of vibration we're talking about. But realistically, the controller is everything. If you buy cheap controllers, you're going to get cheap performance. So that's the only secret sauce I really have, is don't get cheap. If you want performance, you're going to have to pay for it. You get what you pay for.
Now, we've got to close this out, but before we go, could you take a look at this? I took this picture last year at CES. If you go ahead and bring up my computer now. This was at the Kingston desk, and it showed this super crazy, ridiculous high-performance Kingston-based SSD monster. I believe this actually used a lot of the tips that you gave us. It used a RAID card that was specifically tuned for SSDs. It used a lot of your HyperX performance SSDs. I can't remember what the total throughput was on this. Maybe you'll remember. But I remember it was some ungodly number that made my jaw drop.
Yeah. So
is this something that's actually buildable in the real world?
It is, yeah. So everything in this particular machine is available, off the shelf. I mean, you could order all of these parts off of the internet today. In this particular configuration, I had two LSI Mega RAID controller cards with 8 drives connected to each RAID controller in a RAID 0 configuration. It was a pure performance demo, and then what we did was we striped those 2 RAID volumes across the PCI Express bus, and we were getting about 4,000 megabytes a second read and write out of this.
Yeah, I think most people would be happy with that.
Yeah,
4,000 megabytes. I don't know. Sometimes we demand really high performance, but I guess 4,000 megabytes a second might do it. Gentlemen, I'm sorry. I could go on and on and on. In fact, maybe we can talk a little bit after the show before Tech News tonight. But we do have to call an end to it because, again, you've used up another hour listening to the best dang enterprise podcast in the universe. That's according to 99 out of 100 SSD RAID controllers. But I want to send away our panel after giving them a chance to tell us where they are. We thank them for being on here. Let's start with you, Brian. I know you've got Maker Faire coming up in a couple of weeks. What else does the Geek in Paradise have on his plate?
Well, the Geek in Paradise is looking at building some interesting tsunami sensors. We're going to revive a 15-year-old project called Coconuts. Well, maybe, I'm crossing my fingers here, that will float free in the Pacific Ocean and bob in and out of range of each other. It's going to be a high latency, high error rate mesh network that will bucket brigade the data to each other and then eventually to 1 in 20 coconuts that have an iridium modem on it, so we can keep the cost down. But it should give us significantly higher sensor capability for the early detection of tsunamis.
And as Reverb Mike in the chat room has pointed out, it will also allow us to detect where the alien spacecraft have landed so we can blow them up with our battleship. That only makes sense if you watch that really, really bad movie. Curtis, let's go over to you. I know that we're going to be together in Orlando for Enterprise Connect, but what else do you have coming up on enterprise efficiency?
Padre, got a lot going on. Starting tomorrow, I'll be in Austin, Texas for a couple of days. If any of the Twiat Riot is out there, would love to meet up for a cup of coffee. Shoot me a direct message on Twitter at KG4GWA, and we'll see if we can make it happen. And I also want to remind everyone that every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're doing an Interop preview. We're bringing some of the best participants in the conference at the upcoming Interop show in Las Vegas to E2 Radio. We've had some great shows on with all kinds of enterprise topics. This week, we've got Chris from Information Week. He is their editor. He is their strategic CIO columnist. He's also put together the CIO program at Interop. So we're going to be talking about the key issues for IT executives in the enterprise. We'd love to have you there and there for all of our shows leading up to that big conference in Las Vegas the first week of April.
Wonderful. And Cameron, thank you so very much. I know you had to make a trip up here, and so I do appreciate you being in studio. Now, I will say this. We do get our audience upset every once in a while because they feel like someone has come on and just shilled for their company. I love the fact that you just wowed everyone with your technical knowledge. You obviously know SSDs in and out. You understand what goes into making them fast, what goes into making them live long. And I think our audience really, really does appreciate that. So now I want to give you a chance to go ahead and talk about Kingston, talk about where they can find you, talk about where they can find your products, and talk about maybe something coming up that they should be really excited by.
Okay, great. So, so we make a full line of consumer class SSDs, all the way up to server class SSDs for the most strenuous, high write server workloads. You can check us out at kingston.com. I think moving forward, we're going to continue to see prices fall. We do expect prices on SSDs to fall this year in the 20 to 30% range. 4 years ago when we first started selling SSDs, we were at $10 per gig. Today we sit anywhere from about 60 to 75 cents a gig. So it really is a good time to get into this technology. I think once you use an SSD, it's really impossible to go back to a hard drive. The endurance concerns that we've had with SSDs over the last several years, from a client standpoint, with the SSDs that are on the market today, it's really a non-issue. We've got SSDs that will last 15, 20 years with the typical client workload on it. So again, it's really a great time to buy this technology. It's really not that expensive or as expensive as it was. And yeah, check out Kingston and check us out.
Cameron, fantastic. Thank you. Again, thank you so very much. No, we really appreciate it. And I know my audience knows when someone comes in and just knows his field. And I'm hoping that they got that feeling about
thank you.
Yeah. Now, I also want to thank you. That's right. You, the loyal listener, the audience member who comes back week after week after week. It's because you watch Twight. It's because you share it with your friends, with your colleagues, with your coworkers, that we can continue to bring you this program. And so we want to do something for you. We want to make it possible for you to find This Week in Enterprise Tech each and every single week on your device automatically. Just go to our show page at twit.tv/Twight, and there you'll find a drop-down menu that will give you all the different options for dropping every episode onto your device of choice. It could be on your iPad, on your iPhone, on your Android phone or tablet, your PC, your Mac, whatever it may be. Audio, video, high-definition video, we've got the goods, and we want you to be gooder. I don't think that makes sense, but let's go with it. Also, did you know that we have a YouTube page? You can find us at youtube.com/Twight. There we have all the episodes if you want to consume it over YouTube. Plus, we have all the different segments that we've pre-recorded for our shows so that you could watch everything about Pro Gear or Pro Tip or stuff my IT guy says. It's one of those things that we do because we heart you. Also, please follow me on Twitter. You can find me at twitter.com/PadreSJ. That's at PadreSJ. If you follow me, you'll find out what's coming up on future episodes of Twight, and you'll also be able to suggest topics for those future episodes. Go ahead and jump in and follow the Digital Jesuit, even when he's not working in the studio. Finally, did you know that we do this show live every week? That's right, on Mondays at 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. You can find us at live.twit.tv, and if you come and watch, you get to see the pre-show, the post-show. You get to see all the bloopers. You get to see everything that maybe won't make it into the final cut. It's a sort of the real geek's guide to Twit TV. And as long as you're watching us live, why not jump in our chat room at irc.twit.tv? There you'll find probably the most active chat room on the internet, filled with boys and girls, geeks and gals, some of the funniest trolls you'll ever find, and yes, some brilliant, brilliant engineers. Finally, I want to thank everyone here in the Brick House who made this show possible, to Leo, to Lisa, to Karsten, my super producer, to Jason, who's normally my TD, but to Anthony, who's my TD right now, and I don't think he's going to turn a camera on because he's really, really camera shy, but he does good work here. Finally, if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, what do we say? Just keep quiet.
to